cannot see all of you, but I hope that you can hear me. And I have the great pleasure to introduce to you Bob Sternberg. But before, I think we have to listen to some technical issues concerning how to ask questions and all these things. Beatrice, maybe you can start with some explanations.
Okay, yes. Hi, everyone. So business as usual, I would say. So we have you muted because we're a large meeting, but we do want you to ask questions and participate. So if you want to do that, use the Zoom's raise your hand feature. If you hover over your screen, you'll see a menu bar. In there, you see a participants tab. If you click on that at the bottom, there's a blue hand. If you click that, that will signal to us that you have a question. You can also use the chat if you want. We will prioritize questions asked directly via the raise your hand, but we'll also look in the chat. And that's the two rules. I'll turn my screen share off for now and thus give Bob the chance to turn on his presentation.
Bob should turn on his presentation, but in the meantime, I think I have time to introduce him with some words. Is there anybody in this digital room who does not know him? I think many of us know Bob Sternberg. Anyway, here are some biographic data. He was born in the year 1949 in New Jersey, made his BA in psychology at Yale University, got a doctorate at Stanford University. His doctor father was Gordon Bauer. Then he was dean at Tufts University, provost at Oklahoma State, president of the University of Wyoming, and since 2007, he is also honorary professor at Heidelberg University, which we are very proud of. Currently, Bob is professor of human development at Cornell University. Bob Sternberg is an outstanding scientist, and this statement is meant in a triarchic sense. First, outstanding in terms of service for the academic community. For example, as past president of the APA in the year 2003, or as editor of numerous journals. Second, he is outstanding in terms of collecting research money, which amounts to more than $20 million for grants. That's exceptional, I think. Third, and most important of all, he is outstanding in terms of scientific ideas and theories. His triangular conceptions of love and of hate, triarchic theory of intelligence, the investment theory of creativity, to mention only some of his most important contributions to the world of ideas and theories, which he laid down in more than 1,500 publications. In one word, wonderful. It's great pleasure for me to have you here in this lecture series. Bob, thanks for sharing your ideas with us. Today, you will present us your ideas concerning AI. No, not about artificial intelligence, but about adaptive intelligence. And what is this? So we turn over. Bob, the floor is yours. Start your presentation.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, well, thank you so much for being here today with me. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen. It's a great honor to have a chance to speak to you today. Thank you, Joachim, for the introduction, and thanks to all the organizers for inviting me. Today we're going to talk about IQ and what it means and what it doesn't mean. And just to get started, you see on the screen something, and the question is, what is it? Now let's see if we can move this here. Well, this is a Norwegian lemming, just so you know. And now the question is, what is this? Well, some of you know that lemmings are supposed to jump off cliffs. In a Walt Disney movie, they're showing jumping off cliffs to their death. But actually, you can see here that at least one of them felt like something was wrong. Another said, "Shut up, you moron. Do as you've been told. It's for your own good." It's a picture of lemmings committing mass suicide, as in the Walt Disney movie, except the pictures are fakes. Lemmings do not commit mass suicide in this case. As you can see, they were just diving and they got ratings for the quality of their dive. Only one species, I believe, is known to commit mass suicide, and it's not lemmings, it's humans. And that's what I'm going to talk about next, and then talk about why I think that's important. And I should say that some of the slides I'm going to show are a little bit gruesome. You should just know that in advance. So how do humans commit mass suicide? Well, one way is through cults. This is the Jim Jones mass suicide in Guyana. It's not the way it's done today. Today, at least in the United States, the way it's done is by people breathing on each other, courtesy of instructions from a top politician in the United States who models the behavior, whose name I won't mention. But often the behavior of politicians even trumps that of religious or cult leaders. And then another way they commit mass suicide is through weapons of war, through poison gas, through napalm. This is a picture from Vietnam, which was relevant in my day at least. Through air pollution, which kills millions of people every year. Oil spills, food that then gets lost. Industrial accidents. This is after the methyl isocyanate gas explosion at Bhopal. Mercury poison and lots of other industrial poisons, including in the United States, especially if you're poor. Climate change, another human production. This is one in Alaska and one in California. These fires have been very recent. We experience them ourselves when we're in California. Overuse of antibiotics, which leads to resistant bacteria. Urban income disparities, at least in some countries, leading to substandard living conditions for the poor. These are 2 residences in New York City. And at least in our country, my own, as in many others, there are extreme differences in wealth. The lead poisoning occurs in the places like the one at the left, not the one at the right. And it's not just in urban settings, it's also in rural settings where there's also lead and mercury poisoning. And we have, supposedly in the United States, a wonderful medical system. But if you look at that, even that's not being used very intelligently. The rates of hospitalization and deaths, particularly for Black or African American persons, are much higher than they are for white persons. And they're higher for Hispanics and Latinos, and also for American Indians. So for non-white and non-Asian groups, at least in the United States, despite our supposedly fantastic doctors and hospitals, at least that's what people are told, the death rates are very unequal. So what do all these disasters have in common? I mean, why am I even taking up time to mention them? I would argue that they're a result directly or indirectly of intelligence as conceptualized in the post-industrial West. High IQ has its advantages. I'm not here to dump on IQ and say it's meaningless. I don't believe that. High IQ enables us to do well on IQ tests and proxies for IQ tests. The proxies have different names, SATs, ACTs, GREs, A-levels. There are lots of different tests, but what research shows is the tests going under different names are only cosmetically different. They all measure G, or general intelligence, plus some specific factors. A high IQ enables us to create and deliver superpowered stuff with cell phones. So that's good for many of us. It enables some of us to set the alarm on hotel alarm clocks. Unfortunately, not me. I've kind of given up on hotel alarm clocks, but that's probably the Flynn effect, and I'm too old for understanding them. IQ predicts lots of shorter and longer term individual successes. So it does a lot of things. But even long-term success for the individual, which is what IQ tests predict, is short-term for humanity. It's produced a tragedy of the commons. And I think you know what the tragedy of the commons is. It's when what's good for each individual, and that's what IQ tests have been designed to predict, when they're validated, the criteria are individual criteria. What are your grades? What university did you go to? How long did it take you to graduate? How much money do you make? What's the prestige of your job? What works for individuals in the short term, often in the long term, is tragic for the commons. And the example is that in the early days of the United States, when cattle grazed on a common turf, on grass, if each individual farmer tried to maximize his or her individual benefit, eventually there was no grass left and everybody lost. So, and there are many examples. The Brazilian rainforest is another common example. As people cut down trees to maximize their own individual gain on their farm, the whole world loses. Because the characteristics that lead to individual success, which has always been the criterion for saying that IQ tests are valid, they often lead to long-term adverse collective outcomes, like car jams, where each person is in his or her car saying, if these idiots would just take the bus, I could be home by now. Well, each person was supposed to be advantaged by the car, but collectively they lose. And in the epic of COVID-19, you see just how inadequate these tests are. Many parents have been upset, at least in the United States, that standardized testing for college and graduate admissions has been delayed and often canceled as a result of COVID-19, as though the standardized testing is the true measure of intelligence. Yet even many people with high general intelligence failed the most obvious adaptive intelligence test, containing items that are really challenging, like engaging in social distancing, mask wearing, and hand washing. So they get sick, sicken others, and are responsible for the other's deaths. And this includes high IQ people who just decide that they're not going to be adaptive, and the result we see continual increases in many countries, including my own, in cases. We all had the chance to stop this pandemic. We blew it, and still in most of the world are blowing it. Is IQ really more important than basic adaptive intellectual survival skills? Each individual's success sometimes has brought humanity and many other species closer to collapse. So this using as a criterion individual success is often at the long-term cost of entire species, including our own. Moreover, conventional G-based tests, general intelligence-based tests, although standardized, are not fair to everybody. As illustrated by this cartoon, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And that's what we do with IQ tests. I just had a conversation this morning before this talk about how IQ tests favor middle class and upper middle class kids who learn the kinds of abstract analytical skills that the tests favor, but children from rural backgrounds and intense urban backgrounds who learn different kinds of knowledge and skills are often disadvantaged. Going way back in time, primitive hominids presumably did not have the G or IQ points to create the technology to destroy the world. Of course, they probably didn't have the IQ points to create flush toilets either. Again, IQ serves some good purposes. You know, I like to flush the toilet. I mean, you like to, I hope. I'm sorry, you know, it's better than not flushing it. But how many of us have the IQ plus the knowledge to create a flush toilet? Really, that's shared expertise. Many of the things we give ourselves credit for, we don't understand at all. What happens when we turn on a light switch? What happens when we press buttons on our cell phone? What happens when we flush the toilet? We're relying on other people's intelligence. We rely on collective intelligence, which magnifies the effects of IQ plus knowledge, both constructive, like the cell phones, you might say, but also destructive, such as Chernobyl nuclear power plant number 4, before and after the explosion. Some, such as Steve Pinker, say things are getting better, much better. In many ways they are. You know, some things are getting better. The problem, though, is not just today, tomorrow, the next day, but over the long term for our children and grandchildren. And really, it's not so long term. When I talk about adaptive intelligence, as you know, COVID-19 is just a prolegomena. It's a prelude. It's an overture to things to come. Climate change will be much worse. It's just slower. So we're cooking slowly, and not many people aren't even realize we're cooking. And it's starting right now with fires, parched earth, hurricanes, and the like. Some think it's only the roughly 40% of those, perhaps with differing views, are responsible for the ills of the current time. Many of my colleagues in the United States, especially those in the intelligence field, say, well, yeah, that's that 40%, you know, who are going to vote for candidates who discourage critical thinking. It's on them. But societal disasters have thrived under presidents in our country of both political parties, and it's the same in most countries, that it's not just about the 40%. Johnson was a Democrat. So it's anyway. So some might suggest that something or someone else might be responsible. Maybe it's not our leaders. Maybe it's Satan, you know, the devil. Or maybe it's not Satan. Maybe it's the early intelligence researchers and testers who took too narrow a view of what intelligence is. And this is a picture of Sir Francis Galton and of Charles Spearman, two of the pioneers in intelligence theory. These were brilliant men who, with others, developed the ideas of intelligence testing. But they were born in the 19th century, and it's a little late now to blame them. I mean, you know, you can't go on blaming people from the 1800s forever. So you could blame more recent intelligent people like Chauncey and Lindquist, who founded big testing companies, except that the goals of the people who formulated, whether it's Alfred Binet, his intelligence test, or David Wexler, his intelligence test, or Chauncey and Lindquist, was to create a meritocracy rather than a plutocracy. So they were trying to do a good thing. It just hasn't worked out so well. What they didn't know in the early 20th century was how highly test scores, IQ test scores, achievement test scores, you know, it kind of doesn't, whether it's PISA or whether it's A levels, how highly test scores and socioeconomic status would correlate and become intertwined. That in effect, what seemed to be establishing a meritocracy was laundering essentially the power structure of the world. So we might instead blame flesh-eating zombies who prey on the young of society. You know, it might be their fault that things are so dubious now. But I think that the blame is on all of us. And when I say the blame, I'm talking about global warming. I'm talking about pandemics, air pollution, water pollution, nuclear arms and the like, extreme disparities in income. College and universities get useful data for free on who will raise their prestige ratings, whether it's grades or test scores. Wealthy and well-connected parents benefit because they often can prepare their children to score well on whatever tests or school records that are used for admission to universities. Wealthy parents always have the advantage. School administrators can use various measures to show they care about accountability. We only pick the very top students in terms of their grade point average, those, you know, who have a 1.1, or in some countries and others it would be a 4.0, or high SATs or A levels or whatever. Media publishers have magazines and websites that make the money from these competitions. And best of all, society can perpetuate the existing socioeconomic class structure and call it a meritocracy. So they can say, yeah, you know, we're doing it on the basis of merit, failing to realize that the correlations we see are invented, they're created really, rather than some kind of natural thing. So what are the tests in the modern Western conception of intelligence on which they're based miss? And that's what I'm going to talk about next. They miss most what it means to create a better world where people can be intelligent in the true sense of adapting to the environment, broadly speaking. And that includes not only changing oneself to fit the environment, but also shaping the environment and selecting environments rather than destroying the environment and themselves in the process. We do have a choice. So I have sometimes talked about elements of successful intelligence, creativity, where you need creative intelligence to come up with new ideas, common sense, where you need practical intelligence to implement your ideas, wisdom, which is using your ideas to achieve some kind of common good, in addition to the general and domain-specific analytical skills, which schools and tests measure, in which are only, I'm arguing, a small part of intelligence. So, you know, what I have suggested in my theory of successful intelligence, you know, some people say, well, you're going too far. You know, this is beyond, it's really G and IQ, and you're talking about things beyond intelligence. But in fact, rural conceptions, indigenous folk conceptions of intelligence already include these things. I would argue it's the IQ testers who are too narrow, and it's the lay people who recognize there's more to intelligence than just G or IQ. In rural Kenya, we've found conceptions of intelligence that include RIECO, which is close to G. It includes G and domain-specific skills. Luro, which is similar to practical intelligence. Paro, which has aspects of creativity. And Winjo, which is similar in many ways to wisdom. And so let's talk first about creativity. And so what we do when we try to design tests based on these theories is not just to look at, you know, like number series, letter series, vocabulary, reading comprehension. We have creative tests. And these we've actually used for large-scale admissions to universities, in particular Tufts and Oklahoma State. So this would be things like design a scientific experiment on a topic of your choice, or draw a picture of the beginning of time, or suppose the Nazis had won World War II, what would the world be like today? Write a creative story using the title Social Media Died Today. Draw an advertisement for a new brand of bow tie. Create an exciting slogan for your school, or create a new game. And the students have a choice of the domain in which they want to show their creativity. So they get some options here. And so here's one. This is an example that was actually used in the Kaleidoscope project at Tufts. This is a real essay we got when we were doing admissions to Tufts University when I was Dean of Arts and Sciences there. If the Trojans had heeded Laocoon's advice and thrown Odysseus's wooden horse into the sea, they would have defeated the Greeks at Troy. Aeneas would then never have had reason to flee the city, and he would never have ventured to Italy to found Rome. Without Rome, neither the Roman Republic nor a Roman Empire would have existed. Concrete, the arch, plumbing, and the sauna might never have been invented. The modern implications of Rome never having existed are drastic indeed. Lacking even concrete floors, people would resort to sleeping in the mud and without plumbing or saunas, they would be perpetually filthy and generally quite chilly. France could not have built the base of the Eiffel Tower without arches, so tourists would be unable to purchase miniature collectible towers in Parisian convenience stores. And I use that example because it's written by someone whose verbal SAT, verbal test score, and verbal grades were not particularly good. So this is a person who was admitted to Tufts, but if you look just at his grades and test scores, probably would not have been admitted because they don't really measure the creative aspect of intelligence. And when in the Rainbow Project, which was the national study across the United States of many universities, we found that adding creative measures to SATs, which is a measure of knowledge and analytical skills, almost double prediction of first-year grade point average. So these tests did increase prediction of university success. We believe because when students go to a university, it's a relatively novel experience for them, and they have to be creative in dealing with this novel experience. We also found that the kinds of measures we used in this national study involving kids from everything from two-year colleges to very prestigious four-year colleges, that our tests substantially reduced racial ethnic group differences. Our tests are the green and blue bars. In the standardized tests, the SAT and verbal and SAT math, which are similar to ACT, PISA, I mean, those all are very highly G-loaded, showed much higher degrees of ethnic racial group differences. So I talked a little bit about creativity, and now I'll talk a little bit about common sense. And this is a cartoon. Wow, you have 3 master's degrees and a PhD. Yes, it's all very impressive, but interestingly, I have no common sense whatsoever. That's not the sort of thing you should say in a job interview. I don't see why not. So, I mean, this is just to illustrate a guy who has good academic credentials, but whose common sense and practical intelligence isn't so good. And we actually devise measures of these things. So some of the measures we have used in our university admissions program are things like, how would you persuade a friend to adopt an idea of yours that he or she initially does not like? Or in the movie you just saw, they just saw a movie, how can the students get the mattress to the 2nd floor given that it does not fit up the winding staircase? Or in the movie you just saw, a different movie, what should the students do given that the professor from whom the woman wants a letter of recommendation obviously does not recognize her? So a woman was asking a professor for a letter of recommendation. The professor clearly didn't know who she was. Or which of the following strategies would you use to study for an essay test? Or is the romantic couple real or fake? And they see a bunch of romantic couples, half of whom are real and half of whom are posed. So this is an example of a good answer to the professor one. The professor seems not to recognize me by my appearance, but he may remember my name and my work. I would start off by introducing myself, say which course of his I took and when I took it, and then remind him of distinctive features of my performance, such as that I received an A on the final exam and also that my paper was on such and such a topic. I would then say how much I enjoyed the class and how much I learned from it, and that I was hoping that he'd write me a letter of recommendation for medical school, for which I would give him a transcript, resume, and samples of my work. But also I would say I would totally understand if he does not feel he was in a position to write. And in that case, I would not want to, at all to impose on his time. So these tests, the creative and practical ones, don't correlate much with the analytical ones. And what you can see is that practical tests, like creative tests, increased prediction of first-year university GPA. The increase was not as great for the practical test as for the creative test, but it was both statistically significant and substantial. And this, remember, this is all across the country with very different levels of students, very different university grading systems. So it was hard to get any prediction at all. We could up these numbers by controlling for the quality of the university, and thus how hard it is to get a given grade, but we didn't do that. Well, we did it, but we didn't publish those data, which would have made our tests look better. Practical intelligence matters everywhere. Here are honey gatherers searching for beehives. How good are we all at searching for obscure beehives? So they are socialized to be smart, just in a way that's different. If we were to take a test for their job, we wouldn't look very smart, just as they don't look smart for the test for our jobs. We did a project in Kenya on practical intelligence. This is a photo of the school. And here's a sample of an item we used. A small child in your family has homa. She has a sore throat, headache, and fever. She has been sick for 3 days. Which of the following 5 Yad, Nile, Luo herbal medicines can treat homa? The starred ones are correct answers. The thing to notice is that this doesn't look anything like our test. Kids in Kenya do very well on this test. In these rural areas, our kids couldn't get any of them right. Now you might say, well, you know, what does this have to do with intelligence? Well, think about now, and in fact, that's what some reviewers said. But if you look at the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, some of these skills would have been really useful for all of us. These kids learn how to deal with diseases like malaria, schistosomiasis, trichuriasis. So they're alert to these things. We were friggin' asleep. In our sophisticated first world countries, we were just clueless when we actually had a pandemic situation. What we found in the Kenya study was that practical intelligence was negatively correlated with IQ. That's the numbers in the first column. And we think the reason for that is that in our countries, in most of our countries, we're used to greater formal education being associated with higher IQ, both as a cause and an effect. But in rural Kenya, the smart kids actually leave school early, and that's because they're apprenticed. They're apprenticed so they can get jobs that will give them an income. The kids who aren't so smart or who aren't perceived as smart stay in school and gain the academic skills. And it's in the United States, it's not so different. Getting a PhD actually probably results in a loss of income. Then we did a project in Alaska. This is a fishing village in which we worked. This is rural Alaska, Native Americans. And here's an example of an item. When Eddie runs to collect the ptarmigan he's just shot, he notices that its front pouch is full of ptarmigan food. This is a sign that there's a storm on the way, winter is almost over, it's hard to find food this season, or it hasn't snowed in a long time. So again, this is relevant. This is tacit knowledge relevant to their environment. They do well on these tests. We wouldn't. They don't do so well on our tests. So it's symmetrical. And what you can see, I won't spend a lot of time on the data, is that rural students excelled in the indigenous practical skills, whether they're male or female, urban students in IQ. So it's not that the rural indigenous students didn't have skills. It's just they weren't the abstract analytical skills that are emphasized in urban areas and upper socioeconomic classes. Rather, they learned to be adaptive in terms of their own environments. So common sense is not the same as IQ. One could be high in both or low in both, but also high in one and low in the other. And that's what our data repeatedly have shown over the years. And anyone who has spent any time in academia should already know, unless they're blinded by their own need to think that their high general intelligence must mean that they're good, indeed must be good at everything, that you can have academics who are really high IQ, but their practical intelligence leaves something to be desired. I was actually told that I was one of them by my faculty mentor at Yale. After I got tenure at Yale, he said, you should know, since I was studying practical intelligence, that you got tenure here despite your practical intelligence, not because of it. So let's move on to wisdom, which is the last element. And these are some of the kinds of problems we're using in our research. Korah and Tamlin, 2 countries in the Middle East, are having a serious clash. The Taron River flows in the direction from Korah to Tamlin. Tamlin claims that Cora is devoting more than its fair share of the water from the river, is getting ready to go to war over this precious resource. What should the two countries do? And this is happening all the time in the world. Water resources are getting more and more rare. And it's happening right now between the US and Mexico. There are actually rebellions over shipping of water from Mexico to the United States right now. Or another one is give an example of how some passion you have in your life now could be turned for a common good when you grow older. Or Richard and Jennifer broke up. They both left you text messages that they want to talk to you about what happened. You know they both will want you to take their side. What should you do? So here's an example of a good answer. Cora and Tamlin need outside help to resolve their differences regarding river water. They should each appoint a commission of people who are water experts from their own country. This commission should be responsible for choosing top experts to form a 5-person panel. 1 expert should be from Cora, 1 from Tamlin, and 3 from outside with no allegiance to either country. Cora and Tamlin should agree in advance to abide by the recommendation. The deliberations of the panel should be secret, and they should be provided with any resources they need to make a decision. They should propose a solution and vote on it, with a majority decision accepted is their final solution to the problem. There should be no right of appeal of their decision. And we score these using rubrics. So for example, for creativity, we'll look for novelty, task appropriateness and quality. For wisdom, we look for the extent to which an answer promotes a common good by balancing interpersonal, intrapersonal, and extrapersonal interests over the long and short terms. For practical, we look for the extent to which the answer is viable in terms of human and material resources, and it's persuasive, and so on. So these are results, I won't go over all of them, of our project at Tufts, which this is undergraduates over a period of number of years. It was used for admission. And the results were most helpful for those who were neither clear admits nor clear rejects. For students who were in the middle, who were kind of, it's not clear whether they should get in or not. And we did end up admitting many students who otherwise would not have been admitted. They succeeded at the university, and the project improved prediction not only of academic performance, but also of extracurricular performance. The project showed no ethnic group differences, although the admissions officers knew ethnicities, so the results were not blinded. We also did a similar project at Oklahoma State. I won't go into that because I think we're running out of time. Now, I used to think that standardized tests, at least, are good at measuring analytical skills. I no longer believe they're that great. Let me explain why. This is their more recent research. The question was, is STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematical reasoning, the same as what is measured by domain general IQ proxies, or more domain specific? So here are the problems we've used at Cornell. One test is proposing alternative hypotheses. So these are actually for graduate admissions, or undergraduate if you have a specialization, say, in psychology. Marie is interested in child development. One day, she notices that whenever Laura's nanny comes in to pick up Laura from nursery school, Laura starts to cry. Marie reflects upon how sad it is that Laura has a poor relationship with her nanny. And then the question is, what are some alternative hypotheses regarding why Laura starts to cry when she's picked up from nursery school by the nanny? So it's taking a piece of data and coming up with alternative hypotheses as to how this data might have been generated. Another test is designing experiments. Ella, a senior in college, observes that her roommate tends to perform better on an exam if she's had a cup of coffee beforehand, or in my case, while I speak. Ella hypothesizes that drinking coffee before taking an exam will significantly increase one's exam performance. However, Ella does not know how to test this hypothesis. Please suggest an experimental design to test this hypothesis and describe the experiment in some detail. Assume you have the resources you need to be able to do the experiment. And then a third test is assessing validity of conclusions. Bill was interested in how well a new program for improving mathematical performance worked. He gave 200 students a pre-test on their mathematical knowledge and skills. He then administered the new program to them. After administering the program, he gave the same 200 students a post-test that was equal in difficulty and in all relevant ways comparable to the pre-test. He found that students improved significantly in performance from pre-test to post-test. He concluded that the program for improving mathematical performance was effective. Is this conclusion correct? Why or why not? And of course, the answer is that it's not, because there's no control group. So we also had other tests, but in any case, what we found is that the 3 tests of scientific reasoning correlated positively and factored with each other. Tests of fluid abilities, like letter sets, number series, and SAT, ACT, correlated positively and factored with each other. But the tests of scientific reasoning in a Cornell sample showed trivial, or in some cases negative, correlations with the fluid ability measures. In other words, when it comes to scientific reasoning, the abstract analytical tests we use, at least in this country, and I suspect in other countries, were lousy predictors of who would reason in the way a good scientist needs to reason. Thus, the tests of scientific reasoning appear, at least in these samples, to measure reasoning skills different from those measured by standardized tests of fluid ability. Standardized tests thus may provide incomplete and possibly sometimes misleading results for admission to STEM programs. Now, I've talked about some qualities. I've talked about creative intelligence, practical intelligence, wisdom, analytical intelligence. Clearly, there are other qualities that matter: integrity, intrinsic motivation, passion, citizenship, specific talents, emotional intelligence, rational thinking, critical thinking. I'm not denying that. I'm not claiming that this is a complete system. But standardized tests of intelligence and their proxies based on modern Western notions of intelligence are seriously limited and narrow, because modern Western notions of intelligence are seriously limited and narrow. There are available at least prototypes of tests that can expand our conceptions and our measurements. Why don't we use them? Well, like, why is medical testing improved so much from the early 20th century, whereas psychometric testing is almost the same? I mean, would you want medical tests from 1900? Well, essentially, we're using variants of Binet and Simon's 1905 test. And there are a number of reasons why we keep using these tests. I think I should skip them, and maybe if they come up in the questioning. But there are many things in society that keep them going. Like, we're just entrenched, we keep using them, we're thinking in the short term, we're only looking at individuals, we're entranced by numbers, and so on. The Western conception of intelligence values people who are very good at doing what they're told and fitting into an existing cognitive, social, and economic structure. Even creative professions often value those who are creative, working within entrenched paradigms and do not challenge the existing structure of the field. People who are highly creative or wise do not fit well into the structure and are challenged at every turn to stay in their place. So little changes because the existing power structure, which often is hidden, does not allow it to change. And that spells a dismal future. I believe we're running out of time. The problems facing the world are enormous, and psychologists and many other behavioral scientists often have reacted as though these problems are not their problem, they're someone else's problem. They have persisted, especially in the field of intelligence and related fields, in defining problems narrowly, failing to realize that if the world falls apart, there won't be a next generation to continue small or self-satisfied approaches to small problems, much less small approaches to big problems. I have to say that some colleagues in Andrew Conway and Diane Halpern are organizing a symposium where we asked professors to talk about the relevance of intelligence to real world problems. And I've gotten so many letters saying, well, I don't see the relevance of intelligence to real world problems, really. But intelligence is the ability to adapt. It's about real world problems. Binet knew that, Wechsler knew that, and somehow it got lost. I think we went off on a garden path. Here is South Beach, Miami, Florida today. It looks nice. Here's a projected look at South Beach, Miami in the future. Not so nice. It's time to realize that merely smart people with high IQs won't save the beach, our countries, or the world. We need to develop skills that matter more, such as creativity, common sense, and wisdom. And climate change experts have issued what amounts to a last change warning. Why do we care so much about grades when then people go off and do stupid things for which this is the future, which pandemics are the future? We're running the wrong race. At least one black sheep lemming has figured out the right race to run, and so can we. He's the one who's running in the opposite direction, but he's the black sheep of the family. And sometimes being a black sheep has advantages. So please keep it in mind. We can run the right race. We just have to change the way we think about intelligence. And I've suggested adaptive intelligence as a possible solution. So thank you for listening, and I will stop sharing the screen, and I'd be glad to answer questions.
Thanks for this very engaged presentation. Thanks for blaming all of us for running the wrong race. And I think there are many questions. I see many hands showing up. I don't know how to start. What would be a good selection procedure? Beatrice, what is your recommendation?
They're clapping their hands. That's the ones we're seeing. But yes, you can also start raising your hand. So if you go to the participants tab, if you want to ask a question. So there was lots of hands clapping for your talk.
Okay.
I don't see any raised hands yet. You can also use the chat.
We can use the chat. I see no comment in the chat.
But there is a first raised hand.
Where is it? I can't see that so quickly. Can you give the raised hand?
Yeah, so it's Uli Globala, and I'll unmute you.
Where is Uli Globala?
I'm trying.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thanks for all these wonderful graphics. It's I really don't like ballpoint slideshows very much, so you avoided much of that and gave us great pictures. Let's get a little bit more serious. I follow much of what you said. The question is, how do we change the conflict? Many people, and I think it's not that bad, try to optimize their personal benefit and the benefit of their group. That's why we inherit houses, lots of money, gold watches, and all that kind of stuff to our children, hoping that would make their life better. As a matter of fact, we can see quite frequently that it makes their life worse because they do not have to struggle to acquire all these things. The key question would be, how would we implement this much better form of intelligence for the world community? Do you have any ideas on that?
I do. So let me make 3 points, since I tend to do things in threes. The Trinity has threes. I have triplets. My theories have threes. It was hard to get triplets just to keep the threes going. So the first thing I want to talk about is your comment, get more serious, because I've heard that before. To me, things like global warming and pandemics are pretty serious. So yes, the pictures may not look serious, but I think the issues are. The second point I want to make is that I agree with you about our tribal instincts. And so that's what leads to the third point, and that is the research we're doing right now. Right now at Cornell, I have 3 groups working on this in different contexts. On adaptive intelligence is constructing items that can be used in existing curriculum in science curriculum, in social studies or history curricula, and in other curricula, but they're real problems. So in one of the items, we talk about a town that's having a water pollution problem. And the water pollution problem is explained to you, the conflicting interests, you're told something about those, the industrial concerns versus the human concerns. And then you're asked things like, what do you think you could do? What could the town do? What are the obstacles to doing the right thing? We have problems about vaccines. We have problems about air pollution. We have problems about gun violence in schools, which is a big problem in the United States. So what we do is we put into the science curriculum or the social science curriculum or whatever, instead of small problems or multiple choice or test-like problems, we have the kids apply their creative, critical, practical, and wisdom-based thinking to real problems, and then have them discuss with each other what possible solutions there might be, what are obstacles to these solutions, including the tribalism that you so correctly measured. I so much agree with you. Wisdom in my valence theory, which of course not everyone agrees with, is using your knowledge and your abilities toward a common good by balancing your own interests with other people's interests with larger interests. And you can see in some countries, not mentioning my own because that would make it a political talk, how you can get leaders who only appeal to people whose interests are narrowly defined as the same as his. It's a disaster. It's turned two parts of the country against each other. It's like pre-Civil War in this country. And that is a long-term losing strategy. And anyone with any adaptive intelligence knows that. Instead, you should be focusing on what are our common interests and give problems where kids in teams, because real world problems are solved in teams, work together on real problems to find solutions that help to achieve a common good over the long term as well as the short term, by balancing off their own interests with other people's interests, with larger collective interests beyond those of their tribe, by infusing positive ethical values. So I think it's doable. And the way you do it is by teaching kids to think not only for tests, but to think wisely. And then you score. When you do get to scoring, you score in terms of the theory. To what extent do the answers help to achieve a common good by balancing interests over the long and short terms through the infusion of positive ethical values?
Thank you.
And that's what we're doing right now.
May I ask a question concerning the existing power structure? You mentioned there is a power structure which keeps the current system running. So are you calling for a revolution, or what is the political dimension of your talk?
Yeah, well, unlike most people in this country, I don't store weapons in my house. So I think if there's a revolution, maybe won't be the people who benefit. It may not be people like us. I think that where you start is by teaching kids in school to think a different way. What's scary, I was talking about scientific reasoning. Well, let's start by teaching for that. Let's teach, we teach in their schools. They have biology, they have physics, they have chemistry, but they never learn how to think scientifically. I mean, all this anti-vaccine crap. And we have a president pushing quack solutions to the COVID-19 problem, talking about herd immunity, which isn't going to happen. If we taught kids how to think scientifically, not just here's the content of the biology, physics, and chemistry course, that would be a good start. So they don't accept quack solutions to scientific or medical problems, Another thing that would be a good start is teaching them to think wisely. Another thing would be teaching them to think creatively, that when essentially you start getting a sect in your country that steamrolls, and you're in Germany, you know about how sects can steamroll, and that's what's happened in the United States. It becomes like a religious sect where there's a collective mind of people who individually aren't giving a lot of stuff. Teach them critical thinking, to question their own assumptions, question what they're hearing from these leaders, and does it make any sense at all, rather than just cheering them on. So I think there's a lot we could do. I don't think it's about an armed revolution, but doing a much better job of teaching kids to think creatively, analytically, so they have creative ideas, they can analyze the value of those creative ideas, they can apply those creative ideas and persuade others of their value, and then to make sure that they help to achieve a common good. So I think it falls on our education systems, and it's obvious in this country, given what's going on, that it's failing very badly. It's stunning how badly it's failing. I mean, like 40% of the country has joined a cult. And, you know, so we must be failing pretty badly in the way we're teaching these kids.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Further questions? I have no overview. Are there hands raised?
Yeah, and I think Edgar has a question. He let me know. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to thank you, Bob, for the very provocative talk. Actually, I tend to agree with your core topic, your core thesis, namely that when measuring general intelligence, we are measuring the wrong thing, the thing that science doesn't need right now. But let me ask a very, very simple and, well, almost trivial question from the perspective of a psychologist. How do you achieve with your test items that I like very much because of their content, right? How do you achieve with these test items appropriate psychometric properties? I speak about objectivity, I speak about reliability, and I focus especially on those that you listed under creativity tests.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad you asked. This work is all published that I talked about, like on the scientific creativity. And we do all those measures. It's in the published articles. We give the scorers a rubric. We then have them, the way we train them, we give them a rubric. First they work individually, then they work as groups. We then have them go individually again. We look at inter-rater reliability. We look at internal consistency reliability. We correlate the tests with each other or sometimes with university grades. You actually saw that. I showed the data for the Rainbow Project. Those graphs were validity data. I showed you that. I didn't show you the exact tables for the scientific reasoning problems, but they're published. And so you do it the way you would any other. The only difference is that you're not using multiple choice or short answer. You have to have a rubric for scoring. My beef is that psychologists, in their envy of biology or physics, have gone for trivial problems with multiple choice answers or short answers that are easy to score, but are measuring the wrong thing. It's like the old story about the guy who's looking for keys and he can't find the keys and a policeman offers to help him. And the policeman says, the keys can't be here. And he says, oh no, the keys aren't here, they're over there, but the light's better here. And that's what we're doing. We're looking where it's easy to look, but I'm not saying IQ related abilities don't matter, but all you have to do is look at what's happening right now with COVID-19. We have all these very high IQ people making a mess of it. And we need people who are much more creative and have much more common sense and who are wiser. And you got some. I mean, it's a great test of adaptive intelligence. You have it in New Zealand, South Korea. There are leaders who have these skills. And which is more important? Jacinda she was a store clerk before she became prime minister, I think it is, of New Zealand. So it's not about IQ. Ardern was a store clerk. We're talking about people who have the creativity, common sense, and wisdom to solve practical intelligence. And it's not about what university they went to or what their test scores were or their grades. It's given a real problem, can you achieve an answer that helps achieve a common good? And the IQ test is right out there for the leaders. And, you know, in the United States, could there have been a country that failed more miserably with all the technology we have? We're leading the world in COVID cases, yet we have some of the most advanced medical care in the world at places like the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic, but we're failing the adaptive intelligence test.
I see a raised hand, Reva Tambuli, is it right? I give you, I hope I can do that, speaking.
This is your adaptive intelligence test.
Yes, I'm clicking here, but nothing.
Don't worry, it's not a reaction time test. We're not timing you or anything.
Beatrice, what should I do? Aufhebung.
Yeah, that's the right thing. I'm trying to, I don't know.
But it
No.
seems not to work.
I think she withdrew her hand.
Okay, maybe that was a wrong sign.
We do have another raised hand by Uli Glovala. So one more question. So we'll try if we can.
Okay,
Yeah.
Another question, Uli. So we have to give him the.
Or I'll just allow you to unmute yourself. So you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, hi there. Does anybody hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. You may know I'm from Europe. In Europe, we have the European Union, at least in part of Europe. And I would claim that Europe has made a lot of progress in the last 30, 40, 50 decades. We have a pretty peaceful environment, which definitely was not true the years before that. Even the Germans learned to behave pretty much okay in the group of other European countries. They start to initialize soccer championships with 3 or 4 of our countries. And they improve some of the things concerning environmental pollution as well, like reducing air pollution and all that kind of stuff. Some people say it is not fast enough. We have to do it a lot faster. We have young people like Greta Thunberg and many others who say the adults are too slow. Who will win the race? Us or the established people with the power moving fairly slowly, but taking everyone with them, or the more revolutionary, revolution is not the right thing, the more protesting, activating, focusing on one issue kids, who will win the race? Boy, I can't hear you.
Okay. Sometimes it's better if you can't hear me. What I was trying to say, I purposely had it muted so it would look like I'm trying to answer, but you wouldn't be able to hear me, so it would make me look good, but I have nothing to say. I don't know who's going to win the race, but what I do think is that I agree that Europe has done very well. I'm also very impressed with some of the younger people like Thunberg, who have recognized that there is a need for more and faster change than what we have. But the thing to remember is that even in advancing countries, there's a heck of a lot of problems. I mean, like, maybe US media are biased, but like, I keep reading about racism in some European countries. I keep reading about anti-Semitism. I keep hearing about Islamophobia. There are problems with immigration. There are some dictatorships or incipient dictatorships in the European Union right now. There's one coming up in the United States if we stay on this course, but at least two of your countries have gone arguably more in very questionable directions. So I think that I think that almost every, England has, and the UK has had some serious problems. I think there are an awful lot of problems we could do much better at least I hope we can. Whether it's racism or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, or total xenophobia against anyone crossing your borders, these are things we really need to work on. And I think that wisdom is at least part of an answer to some of these problems. That people aren't bad just because they're different from the way we are.
Thanks. I think we have now questions in the chat, and I will start with the first one from Stefanie Lichtenfeld. She asked, I think your items are very interesting, and I think it is important to widen the focus of IQ tests. I wonder to what extent you think that students' motivation to engage with the questions might be relevant when students answer the items.
Yeah, we actually know the answer to that because we have asked in some of our studies about engagement. And the advantage of this kind of stuff is that students are just much more engaged. I don't know what European courses all look like, but a lot of the stuff in US schools, it's really boring. I mean, I've had 5 kids, I have 5, go through US schools, and keeping them motivated is a struggle. I probably shouldn't say this, but yesterday my wife Karen, who's homeschooling this year because of COVID-19, almost felt like giving up because some of the school stuff can be just so deadly. And giving problems that are relevant to kids' lives, dealing with friends, dealing with parents, dealing with climate change, dealing with COVID-19, which is a problem for the kids because they can't see their friends. I think it just motivates kids much more, and they actually can see the relevance of what they're learning in school to their lives. I keep coming back to this really weird thing that's happening. And Yofu, I appreciate your agreeing to participate in this symposium. A number of researchers in the field of intelligence saying, well, I don't see the relevance of intelligence to the real world, so I can't write this. If that's what you're saying, what does that say about your field? That you think that intelligence is just solving number series problems and analogy problems, and if you actually have a real problem, that's not relevant. That's backward. That's like super backward. It's like what was originally supposed to be the predictor, the IQ test problems, has become the criterion. And a lot of times it is the criterion. So we keep validating IQ tests against each other. And if you were to have anything different, it would look invalid because it doesn't measure what the old tests measure. So we create self-fulfilling prophecies, not only for students, but for tests. If they're not just straight G-based measures, and we correlate against traditional test-based criteria, the new measures look to be at fault, rather than saying we have to get out of this closed system. What I've said is that any closed system seems to work. It doesn't matter what it is. So we admit students to Heidelberg University, where you are, say, because they're so smart in terms of their grades. Or we admit students to Cornell because they have high test scores and grades. And then we create a funnel where we only allow the kids, the kids who go to the prestigious universities get more opportunities later on. And then they get into a medical school or whatever it is. So we keep narrowing the funnel in terms of these skills. And then we find the tests predict. Of course they predict. If we admitted students by their height, strictly by height, how tall are you? So that to get into Heidelberg, you have to be really tall. we would say in the United States, say 6 feet 5 inches. I'm not sure how many meters that is. And then to get into a less prestigious university, you're not quite as tall. And then to get into the dumpiest one, you're very short. And then we give more opportunities for graduate study and law, professional study and jobs to the kids who are tall. Then in 20 years, the tall people would be running the country and saying, look, tests of height predict success. Yeah, they do, because we created that system. And that's what we've done with IQ and related skills. We invent a system, we do correlational studies, which don't tell us about causality. And then we, even though we're good scientists, start to think that the correlation implies causation, and that it's the IQ alone that's creating the better outcomes later, when in fact we constructed the socioeconomic and governmental systems to force that outcome.
Okay, now I have 2 raised hands and 3 more questions in the chat. I think we start with the questions in the chat because they have been posted a little bit earlier. Annalena and Tanya have to wait a second. We will come back to that. I think the next question in the chat, so is the IQ test still valid for testing how fast a certain person is able to learn a new skill of a certain level of complexity? That's a question.
Yeah, as I tried to say, maybe unsuccessfully, I'm not against traditional tests. The reason is that abstract analytical ability is part of the theory of adaptive intelligence. It's part of it. So it is relevant for many kinds of things. My point is it's not the whole picture. So professors and teachers like IQ because it does predict generally for simple tasks or not so simple tasks who are going to be faster or easier learners. One of the things that keeps our tests in the United States called the SAT and the ACT going is the kids who score well in those tend to be faster learners. They also tend to be higher socioeconomic status, and they tend to be white Euro-Americans, not a coincidence. So it's good for some things, but what we've learned is that the kinds of problems it's good for are really limited. Think about IQ test problems or standardized test problems versus real world problems. I've actually written all this down, but how do they differ? Well, real world problems don't have a single answer. They're unstructured rather than well-structured. Usually there's no one to recognize the problem for you. It's not like it's a test. You have to figure out, like with global warming or COVID-19, Trump still hasn't figured it out. Then what? Is there a problem? Duh. You have to figure out that there is a problem. You have to define what the problem is, which some of our leaders are defining as, let's just wait for herd immunity, bad definition. Real world problems are complicated, as you know, it's what you study, Yofu. They're messy. They are emotionally arousing. They have high stakes, really high stakes. It's not like the answer doesn't matter. They're usually solved in groups rather than individually. So the problem is we know as cognitive psychologists how difficult it is to get transfer. If we use on these tests, and that's only a partial list, if we use on these tests problems that structurally have almost nothing to do with real world problems, what we will find is that the IQ test predicts school learning tests, and they should, because Binet designed the IQ test to predict school learning. That's what he was asked to do. The problem is when you get to much more complex, unstructured, messy, emotionally arousing problems of high stakes, the learning for that starts to go down. And one of the problems we have, and I've written about this in my work on foolishness, is that people with high IQs tend to think that their high IQ is protective of being foolish, when in fact it's a risk factor for being foolish, precisely because people with high IQs think they can't be. And when I talk about foolishness, what I'm talking about is unrealistic optimism, that it's my idea, so it must be a good idea. I'm talking about egocentrism, that it's all about me. I'm talking about false omniscience, that I know everything, so what do I have to worry about? False omnipotence, that I can do whatever I want, as we see in some of our leaders. False invulnerability, the feeling that I'm so powerful, I can, and this is the problem we have in universities. We get some professors who think they're invulnerable, and they start, harassing other people, or doing, behaving toward other people in unacceptable ways. So, high IQ is no protector against foolishness. And everyone, and that includes me, I'm not just talking about others, it's all of us. We're all susceptible to this. And what we need to realize is that if we want to pick people who are adaptively intelligent, including being wise, the IQ tests aren't going to predict that very well. But will they predict the learning of school tests? Sure, because that's exactly what Binet designed them to do. And he did a good job.
Yes, absolutely. I think we turn over to Tanja Bautzen. She comes from the high intelligence group. And Tanja, I think you should have your mic now open.
Yes, can you hear me? Thanks very much, first of all, for this inspiring talk. I really appreciate this very much, and I've been following your theoretical developments over the years with much excitement. And my question actually concerns an individual differences perspective, and that is, where are we most likely to find the adaptive intelligence you described in your talk? Are there certain groups which are more likely or less likely to show this adaptive intelligence? For example, you mentioned Greta Thunberg, like the people who have a lot to lose, who have nothing to lose. What are your findings on this?
What we find, you may remember I showed a graph that showed different profiles of skills, or maybe I didn't show it, at least we have it. I thought I showed it, but I may be wrong. What we've found is that different groups, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic groups, have different patterns of adaptive skills. So in our studies, at least here, the Euro-Americans and the Asian Americans tend to have higher scores in analytical tests. But sometimes on the creative and practical tests, other groups do better. I just published an article together with Bruce Ellis and a bunch of collaborators on hidden strengths of kids who come from harsh environments. The advantage of a harsh environment is you sort of grow up in the school of hard knocks. If everything is kind of given to you, then you have very little incentive to develop creative and practical skills. If you're kind of royalty, not necessarily royals, or there may be royals, but if you're the royalty of your society, you have lots of people to do stuff for you. Your parents are there. So the premium on creative and practical skills isn't that high. If they went to a good university, they socialize you into their view of intelligence, which is abstract analytical skills. So an advantage of seeking diversity is you also get a diversity of kinds of skills. People who have developed other skills, and what I think we should be doing is developing this full range of skills in everyone. I've sometimes talk in my work about students I taught when I was at Yale for many years, Alice, Barbara, and Celia. Alice being higher in analytical skills, Barbara in creative skills, and Celia in practical skills. And we're only recognizing the Alices. And that's the high analytics. And that's a loss to society because it's clear, IQs rose 30 points in the 20th century, the Flynn effect. So that's 2 standard deviations. That's a heck of a lot. That's the difference between an average IQ and just borderline gifted at the top, an average and borderline learning challenged at the bottom. And the question we can ask ourselves is, what has that 30 points of IQ bought us? And when I look at what's going on in my country, which I will not identify because I don't want to speak pejoratively of a country, so my anonymous country and some other countries like it, it doesn't seem to have bought us a whole lot. I mean, you know, the striking levels of lack of adaptability, people going to rallies even after the president of a random country, you know, himself gets, or herself, since we're trying to be anonymous, gets COVID-19, and they're still breathing on each other and not socially distancing. I mean, like, you know, we need people who are more, and they're all white. You know, almost all of them have very similar backgrounds. Diversity helps because it brings people with different backgrounds. So you're not only learning your tribal knowledge, which appears to be what they're learning, but knowledge from other tribes as well, and then seeking a common good. By the way, Yofu mentioned you're from the high intelligence group. I should mention that I'm from the low intelligence group, that I got interested in IQ testing because I did so poorly on IQ tests as a kid. So you could look at this all as a revenge mission against those psychologists who screwed me in my early years. It's all personal vendetta. I'm only kidding. I'm not like that.
Okay.
The thing is, I'm doing a project with Mensa in Germany. So.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
All right. Thanks very much for the answer.
Thanks, Tanya. We have 9 minutes left, and I see 2 raised hands and questions in the chat. I start with Annalena. Will be next. I hope that it works.
I think it does, yes. Thank you for your very interesting talk. As an intelligence researcher myself, I tend to agree with you that there are some issues regarding the development and validation of classical IQ tests. However, the main point you made was that IQ tests are not predictive of the way we address today's challenges. So we're doing a bad job at addressing the world's challenges. And I obviously agree with that, but I wonder if individual differences, characteristics, are in any way able to predict how we tackle real life world problems, because there may be other properties such as structural organizations, political ideas, things like that, that are not reflected in individual differences of individuals, of persons, that may simply be more predictive. Because, for example, if we look at complex problem solving, which UFO has done a lot of research on, and others, there's a lot of evidence showing that complex problem solving ability is strongly related to intelligence. And some even argue, for example, André Kretschmer, that tests of complex problem solving are nothing more than just applied intelligence tests. So if those two measures are highly correlated, can you actually make the point that intelligence does not predict our ability to solve complex problems, because the evidence seems to say it does, but it just doesn't extend beyond that individual level to like group and real life decisions?
Yeah, again, it depends on what, and thanks for making those points. It depends on what your criteria are. Tests, convergent tests often predict a convergent test. My concern is that even the complex problems that Yofu uses, and I very much admire his work and his group's work and similar work of other people in Europe and beyond, it is different when the stakes are really high versus they're high in a laboratory simulation. When you're emotionally involved because your future depends on it, where you don't even know there's a, you know, when they present problems in life, you know, my wife Karen and I have a website on love. It's called lovemultiverse.com, and I do research on love. A lot of relationships that fail because people don't even know there's a problem. It's so common that husband or wife asks for a divorce and the other one says, what? I mean, like, where did this come from? They didn't even recognize that there was a problem. When it was presented to them, it was much too late. So what I would argue, I don't disagree with anything you said, but that the real world is very different. With COVID-19, you know, the problem was there, but a lot of people didn't recognize that it was a problem, even when they were. Bill Gates has been warning about this for years and has been ignored. They didn't recognize it. When they saw it, they misdefined it. They poorly allocated resources. Some of the stupidest things like drugs that had absolutely no scientific evidence backing them. So I think that if you're talking about laboratory settings, it's one of the things we found early in our research when we're trying to measure creative and practical abilities. I still remember when we developed the famous Sternberg triarchic abilities test, which few people ever used. We learned that multiple choice items were rotten predictors of creative and practical skills, no matter what we did with them. When you go into the real world, the characteristics of problems are just so different that I think that often we need to use problems more like the ones I showed that are real world problems with high stakes that are emotionally arousing and that people get really upset about. And often their upset prevents them from using rational solutions. So I agree with everything you said, but I don't think that even the complex problems are going to save us from the processes used in those laboratory tests are going to save us from COVID-19 or air pollution or water pollution or income. Some of our best economists, I mean, like our really smart Harvard economists, I'm not an economist, but they spend so many years on classical economics. People with, high IQs, probably higher than most of us, certainly higher than me, which isn't saying much. But they had this, self-contained classical economic system, which totally didn't take into account behavior, human behavior. And its predictions were terrible. Eventually, behavioral economists recognized that people in the real world don't act in the way these ideal abstracted systems say they should. So I think that that's what we need to do to get to the problems people really face. And we're at a point in the world where, when I talked about the lemmings, it may not have seemed serious, but I was dead serious. We are acting like lemmings, the real lemmings, not the lemmings who don't jump off cliffs. We're jumping off cliffs. We're letting our landmass disappear. We have thousands of people in my country going to rallies and breathing on each other for ideological reasons. All these other things count too, but we need to learn to think and to say, and part of what is adaptive intelligence, saying emotionally, I may want to be in a group. Emotionally, I want to believe in my dear leader, but that's not a smart thing to do.
Okay. Annalena, are you happy with the answer?
Yes, thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have 2 minutes left and there are 2 questions in the chat. I will combine them and read them both for you in one point. What you said about teaching critical thinking and how psychologists have focused on too narrow an area makes a lot of sense. Do you think teaching how to broaden contextual knowledge will help in speeding the process?
Yes, and thank you. Yeah, I think that's what we need to do. I mean, I'm not against traditional schooling. I just think it's incomplete. And so I guess my message is not that IQ is bad or that traditional schooling is bad, but that it's too small a part of the story. And that with the world kind of falling apart in so many ways, we have to change that. And in our country, with the income disparities we have between the rich and the poor, the multi-billionaires and the people who don't have $400 in a bank account, that's not sustainable. And these people who are the billionaires may have the high IQs, but it is not sustainable in the long term. And if we don't change something, we're going to all regret it. And thank you so much, all of you, for listening. I really appreciate it. And, if you want to email me, my email is robert.sternberg@cornell.edu, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have.
There are 2 more questions in the chat. Maybe we have time for at least a short answer. I will start with the question from M, whoever M is, regarding the answer to the first question. How do we teach teachers to teach children how to think critically and creatively? Aren't schools and academia fundamentally enriched toward producing authority-oriented, uncreative thought structures? I would love to see some interdisciplinary research on that.
Yeah, M, if obviously you don't read James Bond, M is the head of British intelligence. I hope that if you learn nothing else from this talk, you learn that. I think that teacher education today is, unfortunately, at least in my country, very focused on tests. Maybe in some countries it's PISA, in other countries it may be SATs or state tests. But these tests, for the most part, don't measure the kinds of real world thinking that we need. So we can be teaching teachers to think in a more Socratic way, which is what at least I try to do in my classes, that encourage kids to think with real world problems, so that the transfer to the real world isn't so great, because that's what they did in the school. And that's what I have suggested, and that's what we actually do. Okay,
last question. Thank you very much for this engaging talk. It's not the question. I mostly agree with your analysis, particularly concerning how and what is taught in school, disadvantaging specific groups with different backgrounds. Question: concerning the lack of correlation between IQ and scientific reasoning, I was wondering if this may have to do with a too small variance given a student sample comparable to not finding a G factor in intelligence when only testing high IQ samples.
Yeah, we worried about that too. That's why I was sure I mentioned that they were Cornell students. We would have to look at it in a broader sample, but what's not so clear is why that might reduce the magnitude of the correlations, but some of the correlations were actually negative, and we wouldn't have expected that it would change the direction of the correlations. The other thing I'd remind you of is that, and this is true in all my practical intelligence work, what we're dealing with is populations of students who might actually go into science. So we're generally not dealing with people who are in the lower range of IQs, who are less likely. You know, if you have an IQ of 80, you're probably not going to become a scientist. We're dealing in the range of people, and Cornell is much more diverse than most of the Ivy League schools. You may not realize this, but we have a hotel school, we have a business school, we have a public policy. It's very broad, but it's not, you know, we're dealing with kids who really might become scientists, and that would exclude some of the lower IQs. At the same time that I agree with you, and I absolutely think it needs to be tried within a broader range. So I'm going to say thank you again, and I think this is really the end, and I hope we'll stay in touch.
Thanks for giving us a presentation. Thanks for discussion. Thanks to all discussants. And next week, I think, is another fantastic talk by Rakefet Ackermann. Is that true? I think that will be the next week's program. Come in, join us next week. Thank you very much for this talk. Bye-bye.
Maybe, Bob, if you can put your email address in the chat. Someone was asking about it.
Okay, I could do that, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Oh, sure.
Fascinating talk.
Thank you.